Okay, we are back on track now with item number 7, which is our discussion of the officer-involved shooting case. Before we have this discussion, I'd like to caution the members of the board. Many of us have gone and either read or listened to, or both, the Garrity statements. I just want to caution the board that those statements are protected by ordinance. We cannot give quotes from those. We cannot discuss what we learned from those. We viewed those in order to inform our opinions, but we don't get to discuss the specifics of those. I'll ask Mr. Baker to speak on that as well.
Chair Moore, members of the board, just briefly, I think that the chair gave a good synopsis. Under the ordinance, the manner in which Garrity is dealt with is partly already dealt with, which is by voting by majority to have access to it and review it. And I understand that Internal Affairs provided that access, and you were able to review the information on at APD. You're able to discuss the investigation, what you learned from it. The only limitation is the Garrity material, and the restriction on that is that the board is limited to summarizing conclusions reached after reviewing Garrity statements. The specific content of the Garrity statements are remain confidential. The other restriction is not to refer to the officer by name. And under the policies and procedures, since this is the first officer-involved shooting you all are taking up, the mandate for the board is to review the proposed findings and recommendations that Mr. Harness prepared, and by majority vote, either approve the findings and recommendations as proposed, approve other findings and recommendations as the POB determines are supported by the investigation file, or if you were to decide additional investigation or analysis was necessary, you could defer action. But those are the three outcomes of a review that the policies and procedures contemplate. If I interrupt anyone at any point, the only reason I would do that would be if I feel like someone's going to inadvertently walk into to a pothole under the rules of the road here, and so I apologize if I do that. It's not personal. I'm just trying to help you guys navigate this successfully, which I'm sure you all will. But beyond that, everyone should feel free to speak their mind against this, as the board was created and contemplated having done.
And Mr. Baker, just a point of clarification, the video, which is from the officer's body camera, is that part of the Garrity material, or is that something that could be discussed, or do we know? So
a Garrity statement is only a compelled statement an officer is required to make under threat of disciplinary action. Video would not qualify. Video of conduct underway would not qualify as Garrity material.
Thank you. Mr. Harness, I know that you presented this last time a little bit, but would you do it again, please?
Excuse me. Chair Moore, fellow board members, certainly. As the executive director of the CPOA, I reviewed the investigation conducted by the Internal Affairs investigators, the multi-jurisdictional investigative team, which included a review of the applicable SOPs, the complaints, the SID/narcotics team interviews, the CAS reports, the arrest reports, officer interviews, and lapel videos and lapel synopsis. I also spoke with the district attorney's office. I spoke with the district attorney here in Brandenburg to ensure that this administrative review would not interfere with the still pending criminal investigation at the district attorney's office. The district attorney's office offered no substantive reason why this administrative review could not move forward. It's important to point out that this is only an administrative review, that there is no relation to the criminal investigation, because these are different standards. We're simply reviewing whether or not there were infractions of standard operating procedures for the Albuquerque Police Department as it relates to this incident. The first question, did Lieutenant B comply with Albuquerque Police Department Special Investigation Division undercover investigation policies for operational planning? That SOP states, in addition to operational planning, the undercover detective will review the anticipated scenario with the supervisor and determine if there will be any unusual circumstances that surveillance detectives should be aware of. On January 9th, 2015, members of the Albuquerque Police Department Special Investigations Division, Narcotics, decided to conduct a buy-bust operation. The operation would include 2 undercover officers, Detective H.G. and Detective J.G. There were 4 other members of this narcotics team. Detective H.G. had a target she'd been in contact with over the past 24 hours. This target was going to supply $50 to $60 worth of methamphetamine. The buy was to take place in the Western Scotland corridor. Detective H.G. agreed to drive to the location to meet the seller. Between the hours of 9 a.m. and 9 to 10 a.m. on January 9, 2015, Detective H.G. conducted an operational briefing for the buy-bust. The attendees of this briefing were Sergeant S., Detective R., Detective M., Detective H.G., and Detective J.G. Lieutenant B did not attend this briefing. The operation would have 2 targets. Detective H.G. would drive her undercover car in a 2007 Lexus. The Lexus had darkly tinted windows, however, according to all involved, this did not present a problem in the opinion of the operational team. Detective H.G. would wear a wire to transmit conversation from inside the vehicle. Additionally, Detective J.G. would have an iPhone-based listening device. The operation would entail picking up the 2 targets, driving to the location for the buy, and then driving to a different location for the bust. Other details discussed in the briefing included the signal for the bust, the time to execute the arrest, and most importantly, in accordance with the unit's protocol, Detective H.G. would drive and Detective J.G. would be seated directly behind on the driver's side rear of the vehicle. As the team exited the briefing room, Sergeant S. called Lieutenant B on an unrelated matter, but mentioned the operation that was about to take place. Lieutenant B was downtown at the main police station and stated that he would begin making his way over to the area of the operation. No other details of the operation were discussed during this telephone conversation. While en route to the area of the location, Lieutenant B turned on and monitored the police radio narcotics channel. During this broadcast, the 2 targets were described as black males, one wearing a white jacket. Also that the buy was taking place at the O'Connell Lodge. Lieutenant B parked his vehicle and waited in the parking lot of the adjacent McDonald's. He waited for the bust portion of the operation to begin. Once the buy took place in accordance with the briefing plan, the team drove away from the buy location. Detective H.G. pulled the 2007 Lexus into the McDonald's parking lot. Lieutenant B pulled in directly behind the Lexus in front of fully briefed team member vehicles. Once the Lexus was parked, Lieutenant B exited his truck, pulled his weapon, and began shouting commands to the occupants of the vehicle. The CPOA finds Lieutenant B's conduct sustained regarding the allegations of a violation of this SOP, which means the investigation determined by a preponderance of the evidence that the alleged misconduct occurred. Number 2, did Lieutenant B comply with Albuquerque Police Department procedural orders mandating the general requirements and expectations with regard to the use of force? Officers may use force when objectively reasonable based on a totality of the circumstances. The objectives for this force may be appropriate. The objectives for which force may be appropriate include to effect a lawful arrest or detention of a person, to gain control of a combative prisoner, prevent and or terminate the commission of a crime, to intervene in a suicide or a self-inflicted injury, to defend an officer or member of the public from the physical acts of another. Reasonable force requires balancing the government interest in seizing a person weighed against that of the individual's Fourth Amendment rights. In general, the greater intrusion against the individual, the more objective justification needed to be in a reasonable course of action. When determining whether force is reasonable and the level of force used, officers will also consider threats presented by the subject to the officer and/or public and the immediacy of them, the severity of the crime being committed by subjects, attempts by the subjects to actively resist arrest or evade arrest by flight. The Supreme Court has held that uses of force by police must be evaluated under the totality of circumstances known or perceived by the officer at the time the decision to use force is made. Independently, the following will not justify a use of force. However, officers should be alert to the following circumstances throughout their encounter with a subject. Known history of the subject to include violent tendencies, previous encounters with law enforcement which were combative. Known or perceived belief the subject is under the influence of alcohol or drugs. Relative size, age, condition of the subject as compared to the officer. The number of subjects compared to the number of officers. Availability of weapons to the subject. Duration of the action. Example given, officer exhaustion during a physical confrontation. The subject's mental or psychiatric history known to the officer at the time. Where it is apparent to the officer a subject is in a state of crisis, this must be taken into account in the officer's approach to the situation. Presence of innocent bystanders who could be harmed if force is not used. Location of incident and probability of sympathy for the subject amongst bystanders present. Special knowledge possessed by the subject, i.e. known experience in martial arts or hand-to-hand combat. Physical confrontations with the subject in which the officer is on the ground. Environmental and terrain factors such as an incident near a busy street. Officers must be able to provide an objectively reasonable basis for any factors used to justify the level of force used. When circumstances allow, in their interaction with subjects, officers should use advisements, warnings, verbal persuasions, and other tactics in an attempt to resolve the incident. When practicable, officers must not engage in unreasonable action or tactics that precipitate the use of force as a result of tactical, strategic, and procedural errors that unduly jeopardizes their safety or the safety of others. Officers must continually assess the effectiveness of their actions and consider the desired outcome of the level of force used, including, can the resistant subject physically comply with the officer's commands? Does the officer have the ability to utilize additional resources to bring the situation to a peaceful resolution? What is the officer's end objective for using force, and is the risk of injury to either the subject or the officer worth achieving this objective? As agents of the government, officers must attempt to balance the public need of effecting the arrest of the individual against that of the individual's rights. When a confrontation escalates, suddenly an officer may use any means or devices necessary to defend him or herself as long as the force is reasonable given the existing circumstances. Deadly force. Use of deadly force still falls under the general requirements of all uses of force outlined in 2-52-3 of this policy. Additionally, the reasonableness of the officer's decision will include reasonable belief that the subject presents an immediate threat to cause serious physical injury to the officer, another officer, or another member of the public. Or probable cause for the officer to believe that the subject has just committed a crime involving inflicted or threatened inflictions of serious physical injury to another, and deadly force is necessary to prevent the escape of the subject in order to protect the public or other officers. 2-52-5 response to high threat level situations. Paragraph B, When reasonable under the totality of the circumstances, officers should gather information about the incident, assess the risks, assemble resources, attempt to slow momentum, and communicate and coordinate a response. Supervisors should become involved in the management of the overall response to the potential violent encounters by coordinating resources and officers' tactical actions. Individual officers should not arrive on a potentially violent encounter and attempt to resolve the incident by themselves. Officers should arrive and secure additional less lethal resources as a part of a force array prior to initiating contact. Although these tactics are intended to provide a force array for officers to resolve unknown violent encounters, this section in no way prohibits officers from responding independently to violent ongoing calls involving death or great bodily harm. On January 9th, 2015, at approximately 11:30 a.m., Lieutenant B approached the 2007 four-door Lexus with his weapon in a low-ready position. He used his left hand to open the rear driver's side door. From about 1.5 to 2 feet, he observed the occupant of the seat directly behind the driver holding a handgun. The handgun was pointed toward the opposite side of the vehicle. Members of the arrest team were approaching the vehicle from the rear on the opposite side. Lieutenant B yelled, "Gun, gun, gun," and 1 second later, according to the televideo, he began firing his weapon into the driver's side rear of the 2007 Lexus. Lieutenant B retreated from the vehicle while firing his weapon, a .45 caliber handgun. He emptied the first magazine and reloaded his weapon. 17 seconds after he began firing into the vehicle, he realized the occupant of the vehicle holding the gun was Detective J.G. He fired 7 or 8 rounds into the vehicle. Albuquerque Police Department use of force policy mirrors the U.S. Supreme Court decision Graham v. Connor 490 U.S. 386, 1989. Use of force must be analyzed under the Fourth Amendment's objective reasonableness standard. The officer's action must be reasonable in light of the facts and circumstances confronting them. Lieutenant B has conducted hundreds of these buy-bust operations. What was the totality of the circumstances facing Lieutenant B? What were the facts that he knew or should have known as he approached the 2007 Lexus? His personnel: he worked with JG, Detective JG, for over 2 years, and Detective HG for a few months. Detective HG was the driver of the 2007 Lexus. His personnel would be armed. The 2 subjects of the operation are black males, 1 black male wearing a white jacket. He knew he did not attend the briefing session for the operation. He knew he had not been fully briefed during the operation. He knew the standard protocol for his SID narcotics operation. When a UC detective is driving the vehicle and another UC undercover is in the vehicle, the other UC always sits behind the driver for officer safety. There's an additional factor to consider in this case. In or around March of 2014, the commander of the SID Narcotics Division counseled Lieutenant B about 2 incidents. One occurred in January of 2014, the other in March of 2014. The commander's directives to Lieutenant B were to only involve himself in operations as a supervisor, to be there for command and control. Secondly, only insert himself in an operation where there was an emergency. Sergeant S stated Lieutenant B had not inserted himself in an operation since the March 2014 talk from the commander until the morning of January 9, 2015. If Lieutenant B had come upon a traffic stop with similar circumstances, the use of force in that case may have been objectively reasonable. However, this is not a traffic stop on a high-risk vehicle. This was an operation being conducted by his team, which by all accounts was going well until he inserted himself in the operation. Lieutenant B is not entitled to the same protections afforded an officer in unfamiliar circumstances. The kind of circumstances that could not have been known by the officer at the time of the use of force. Lieutenant B ignored readily available information, his commander's directives, and his team's standard operating protocol for undercover operations. Therefore, I find the use of force in this case to be unreasonable. The CPOA finds Lieutenant B's conduct sustained regarding the allegations of a violation of this SOP, which means the investigation determined by a preponderance of the evidence that the alleged misconduct did occur. 3, did Lieutenant B comply with Albuquerque Department General Order 1-02? Officers shall use discretion during the performance of their law enforcement duties. When sworn employees of this department are faced with a situation where discretion can be exercised, they must evaluate the circumstances, consider the available resources, and rely on their training, department policies, department procedures, statutory law, and supervision in making the appropriate decision. In addition, within each situation, the appropriate decision should be the least restrictive that still accomplish the intent of the law, that is in accordance with department policy, and does not compromise officer safety. Based upon the review of the case as I've outlined above, CPOA finds Lieutenant B's conduct sustained regarding the allegations of a violation of this SOP, which means the investigation determined by a preponderance of the evidence that the alleged misconduct did occur. CPOA recommendation for discipline of this employee is termination of his employment. In addition, policy recommendations. Immediately only allow buy-bust operations after the scenario has been fully briefed in person by all supervisors and participants. End the practice of radio briefings. Immediately prohibit non-briefed parties from participating in any operation unless officers request backup. Mandatory drug testing for all personnel discharging their firearms as a standard protocol in a post-use of force investigation. Training recommendations. The SID should immediately review all of its policies and procedures with all of its assigned personnel. All personnel operating in an undercover capacity must attend DEA training. Counsel personnel to pay close attention to details, i.e., no police equipment in an undercover car. Stand for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Harness. Are there questions by the board?
I have a question. It's the very last line that you said. It says no police equipment in an undercover car. Does that include them being armed? What does that mean?
Chair Moore, Board Member Fine, what I'm alluding to is facts discovered in this case. There was a circumstance where there was a large suitcase that was in the back seat of the vehicle that they wanted to put in the trunk of the vehicle, but the detective's police gear was in the trunk. Therefore, they could not put that large bag in the trunk because it would have blown their cover. Certainly, I don't believe that firearms would fall into that category. That certainly they need to be armed as a part of the operation.
Okay, thank you.
Other board member questions? This is a really tragic case, and the detective was shot numerous times. The fact that he survived was almost a miracle. In my review of the body cams that the lieutenant was wearing, I could hear in the background his radio, which had information that would have and should have led him to not do what he did. On the radio, I could hear the other detectives discussing the fact that there was a detective behind the wheel as the driver, that there was one black male suspect that entered the passenger side front, another black male suspect that entered the passenger side back. There was no mention of who was in the driver's side rear. One would hope that someone would be able to figure out that that was the extra detective, but even not knowing that, the notion that there would be another detective in there should have made Lieutenant B more cautious. The fact also really bothered me that he opened fire without giving any commands. He yelled gun 3 times and opened fire without telling the person possessing the gun to do anything. And that bothered me as well. Not only was the detective sitting in the back seat struck, the detective sitting in the front seat was struck. This was just an extremely unsafe and tragic situation. Are there any comments from the board? I would entertain a motion then to approve the
I move
findings.
that we sustain the findings.
I'm sorry?
I move that we approve the findings.
Approve Mr. Harness's findings. A second? Is there any more discussion? All those in favor? Please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed?
Aye. No,
You are unopposed.
I don't know which way to say it. I'm opposed.
You are opposed to these findings.
I really struggled with this, and went in reviewing the information with one thought in mind. I mean, I had pretty much made up my mind. But after I reviewed the case material, I ended up thinking, really that we're asking maybe the wrong question, and I feel that after this all goes through, that whatever courts this case ends up going through, that we need to have a wider conversation with our community about this case. But for that reason, I'm voting no.
Okay. We have two members that are new to the POB and are therefore unable to vote because they haven't received their initial block of training. So we have two members that would abstain. We have one no, and the rest are in favor. Any other discussion?
Yes, ma'am. I noticed in reviewing this that this is one of literally hundreds of by-bus cases that APD conducts annually. And when we are short of officers and have enough crime happening without the police department creating it, why do we have to create hundreds of additional cases of crime in order to enforce the law? That it seems to me we've got plenty of crime for the police to be working on without them having to create hundreds of additional crimes. This tragedy would not have happened if they were simply enforcing the law against crimes that were taking place. They themselves set this up and caused it to take place. So I have a problem with the entire system of that.
Yes, Ms. Fine.
I understand what you're saying, but I also am not okay with drug dealers dealing, in the street. I mean, there's got to be an entry-level place in which you say this isn't okay. So I understand what you're saying, but I'm not okay with ignoring it either. And so I think that the police are between a rock and a hard place in terms of not being able to have enough officers to do those kinds of things. But, perhaps in a better world, we would have more police officers and would be able to do that. But to say, we shouldn't be pursuing these kinds of by-bus things, I'm not sure I agree with that.
Well, Ms. Fine, you and I are friends, and
Oh, yeah.
I'm not fussing at you, but I submit that there are streets here in Albuquerque that the police could drive down in plain clothes and undercover and find enough drug trafficking going on that they could make a lot of arrests without having to set them up.
Okay, thank you. In terms of some other policy recommendations, I have a couple things that I will bring to APD through the Policies and Procedures Subcommittee. One of those includes that the tint on the undercover car should be legal. The fact that there was virtually limousine tint on this vehicle contributed to the fact that when all the officers came up, unless the windows were open, they were unable to see inside, and that rear the rear driver's side window was not rolled down. So I believe the tint was a factor. APD has already addressed the standardization of firearms generally. I found that to be of concern in here. I was also very concerned that The detective who was wearing the wire didn't have the kind of equipment that could broadcast to all the other detectives on that frequency. It wasn't recorded because it malfunctioned, but even just as the incident was happening, the other detectives couldn't hear the air. If they did, they would have heard the fact that there was something going on inside the vehicle that was out of the ordinary that caused the detectives to act differently than they might have otherwise. And so having wires that are reliable that the other detectives can hear is a real safety issue that was a big concern to me. Some of you know I'm retired from the San Diego Police Department. I worked Vice. We had wires back in the 1980s, back in the dark ages, when everyone on our team could hear them. And so I was stunned that that was not the case here. And to me, that's just a real officer safety concern. Any other comments before we move on? Thank you.